Welcome, everyone.
Everyone will put their mic on, except for the speakers, could put their mic on mute. I appreciate it. We will have at least 15 minutes at the end after the three presentations for us to take additional questions. We have questions that have been sent in advance, and we also will be able to take more questions. So if you hold your questions until then, just focus on what the speakers are saying and doing. And then we'll have plenty of time to involve you in the call. Okay, Kim.
So my name is Kim Barker, and I am so excited for this webinar today. I believe that excellent culture, change, and leadership skills are critical for conducting ourselves in the world. I hope that you agree with this, and that maybe you'll be more convinced of this by the end of our time together. I would like to thank the International Society for Organization Development and Change for hosting this webinar. ISODC is a leading international collaborative movement promoting and affecting positive growth and change at the individual, team, organizational, and societal level. I encourage you to go to isodc.org to look at the organization further and consider joining. I would like to introduce you to three esteemed gentlemen today. And I'm trying to, go to my next slide here. There we go. Doctors Fons Trompenaars, Jerry Glover, and Roland Livingston. I urge you to hold all questions till the end, and we will address questions in the chat room at that time. I am so excited to introduce our first speaker, Fons Trompenaars. In addition to being a consultant, training, and motivational speaker, and author of many books on the subject of culture and business, he is one of the kindest and funniest people you will ever meet. Dr. Trompenaars is known all over the world for his work. Fons grew up experiencing cultural differences at home, where they spoke both French and Dutch. After his PhD at Wharton, he worked with Shell Oil in 9 different countries. Fons wrote the book, Riding the Waves of Culture, Understanding Cultural Diversity in Business. This book alone has sold over 120,000 copies and has been translated into French, Dutch, Turkish, Chinese, Hungarian, Portuguese, and more. He has co-authored numerous other books and articles. Just Google him, you will be very impressed. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to Dr. Fons Trompenaars.
Please mute your microphones if you're on the call. If you can, please. Okay, Fons.
Okay, yeah, we'll put it on. I need some slides to be supported. Wonderful to be here. It's a great honor to do this with Kim, Roland, and Jerry together because there is a lot of need for cumulative knowledge in this fairly complex world that we are creating together. Since I have little time, let me cut some corners. And since I'm doing this from Amsterdam, did you know that about 15 years ago, 7% of the people living in Amsterdam who were not Dutch, had parents from Turkey, expatriates from the UK or America, whatever, 7%. Today, 15 years later, it's over 50%. It's 53% in Amsterdam are people living here that don't have Dutch parents. And what I'm trying to say is that the world, next to obviously some crises like the Syrian war, where we have a lot of refugees, but there is a tendency that we really get more and more global, even if we don't travel. And our mindset is still very home-like. It's very basically culturally biased. So if you look at the leadership literature, and let me focus on that one, you smell America when you read the American author talking about leadership. When you read a French book, which is more about education and are you male and living in Paris, you see that it's very French. And you read a book on leadership by the Chinese, and you smell China. So that is in disharmony. The world is getting more international, and our models are still culturally biased. Then on top of that, most of our models, in fact, regardless of culture, are very often bipolar. That means, let's take an example, Myers-Briggs. If you score high on thinking, you score low on feeling. In MBA education, you're either centralized or you're decentralized. Now, these two combined, namely bipolarity and cultural bias, plus the fact that the world is getting more international, makes us go from crisis to crisis, because it seems it's not good enough to go into a world where we need to take advantage of diversity rather than making wars. Now, this has led in organizations, having organizations that look like this. And sorry if your company is not represented by our slides, but these are the wonderful companies that have suffered from bipolarity and the lack of culturally savvy type of approaches. What is the alternative? The alternative is what Einstein said. If you ever have a problem, never try to solve it at the same level it was created. And there are ways of doing that. We have innovation, sustainability, globalization, and leadership as ways of doing this. Let me connect those four within one sentence. Globalization leads to different viewpoints, of which the essential role of the leader is to connect, which is another word for innovation. Innovation is connecting different viewpoints, which leads to sustainable results. So all the fashionable terms are all about how can we connect opposites. It's the essential role of a leader. It is caused by globalization. It leads to more innovation and to sustainable results. But what I'm telling you is that our models are not inviting us to do so. So what can we do? And I will focus in my coming 15 minutes in terms of what this means for leadership. Now, creating wealth, which is, I think, the essential role of a good leader, is to combine values that are not easily joined, therefore scarce, therefore profitable. In other words, creating wealth is like Apple did, combining aesthetics with functionality. In Formula One and the racing, it's combining safety with speed. And those don't come logical if you have a bipolar scale. You're either safe or you're speedy. While every engineer in the Formula One will say, how can I use the speed to make the car more safe? And aerodynamics is an example. In Apple, every aesthetical design person will say, can we make this functional? Every engineer in high tech will say, can we make this beautiful? And you will see that that is the type of world leaders need to create. But we need other models. And what we have found, there is a wonderful model developed by Greenleaf called servant leadership. Servant leaders, already the label says, they use serving people in order to lead, and they need leadership in order to serve. Now, what is the definition of servant leadership? And why I got so excited by what I read about servant leadership is that it's one of the few leadership models that enables people in multicultural teams to be effective. All the other leadership models I know are very culturally biased, and they don't work in multicultural environments. So let me give you some examples. Now, first of all, dilemma thinking, namely the thinking in opposites, and dilemma reconciliation, combining opposites into a larger whole. I was practicing that 20 years ago within a small little company called HSBC, the #2 bank in the world. And this was in Japan, and this was the marketing and sales division group of international of HSBC, had a London-based Shanghai bank. And they were worried because at that time, there was a risk that there would be a financial crisis in Asia. the older listeners would remember that. And there were a lot of Americans worried about that. As you know, Americans are very good in consulting people how to avoid financial crises. And later they went into how to create them. Now, they said to the Japanese, but for most of Asian culture, you have to be more objective. You are thriving on networks, on subjective people that you know, and you need to be more objective. And the Japanese said, hi, 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 meaning I don't get a clue of what you're saying. So they said it again, but louder. And they found out that the Japanese didn't have a good word to capture the essence of what is objectivity. And at the end of the day, they said, we got a word that is close, and we call it kyakanteki, which literally means the outsider's viewpoint. The outsider's viewpoint is objective. Shukanteki is subjectivity, is more the Japanese way. It is the insider's viewpoint. And we came to this dilemma, and we said, as the dilemma, which is connecting opposites, you need to crack the line. If you crack the line, you get kyakanteki on the vertical axis and shukanteki on the horizontal axis. And we showed them this picture. And we said, what is this? And obviously, nobody knew. And we came with the solution. This is a picture of the view of a bridge of the Japanese garden. And if you look from the side, you see the bottom one at the bottom right-hand corner. And in the top left-hand corner, you see the view from the top. In fact, these are two different pictures, but if you go one level higher, like Einstein said, you combine the two and you get a better picture. So lo and behold, I come on Heathrow and I see the following advertisement. And I don't know if you remember that advertising campaign, work, play, play, work. And this was one of the examples. They have 50 of them. And it was based on the following: a different point of view is simply the view from a place where you're not. And that is what servant leaders do.
Yeah.
They connect viewpoints into a higher level. And we took at the workshop in Tokyo the idea of the Japanese garden, which is an invitation to connect viewpoints. Now, this is obviously metaphorical, and I would like to give you some ideas on how to practice this. So let me summarize. The world is getting more diverse. Our models are bipolar and culturally biased, including the models of leadership. We need a model of leadership that combines opposites, which for me is the essential role of a servant leader. And we need to practice people how to do that. And let me show you our approach. First of all, we help people recognize the different viewpoints with cultural models. Then to respect those differences, which lead them to dilemmas. When you respect opposites, individual is okay, team is okay. Ooh, that's a dilemma. That you need, third R, reconcile. And then as a leader, realize and root. That's our approach. And I would like to practice that a couple of times in the next 10 minutes. So I keep to about the 20 minutes I was given. Because you will hear Jerry and Roland, and I don't want to take anything from their time. But then you get a sense of my idea of leadership, and it's all captured in our book, Servant Leadership Across Cultures. Now, first of all, an example I always like to give, for those who don't know, my car accident example, which shows so clearly the dilemma, but then also ways of reconciling it. The question is as follows. You're riding in a car driven by a close friend. Your friend is speeding, going 30 miles an hour where you're allowed to go, 50 miles an hour where you're allowed to go 30, and he hits a pedestrian. You come to court and the lawyer of your friend says, don't worry, you're the only witness. Two questions. What is the right of your friend to expect you to testify to the lower figure, to lie for your friend? My friend has a definite right, some right, no right. Second question is, would you lie, yes or no? Now, I could ask you, would you like to be in this situation? And I know the answer because I've done this more often. I've never had a participant who said, nice situation to be in. And if you go a bit deeper, they say it's a dilemma. And it doesn't matter if you're American, Dutch, Chinese, or Nigerian, people will say, this is difficult. Because as human beings, we have the same dilemma. But then you ask for the answer, and then you see huge differences. Now, organizations know this. So they said, gee, I know that there is a tendency in Asia to rather help a friend, while in North America, Canada, US, or Northern Europe, they're more Protestant. It's more about the truth. You should not, even good friends would not expect that from you. How can we solve that problem when we go international? So they created values around this dilemma called rules versus exception. And integrity is a very popular one. So for me, the value of a value is, does it help you to reconcile dilemmas? So I asked in a financial service group in America, if your value is integrity, what would your answer be? And there was an American who stood up and said, Mr. Trompenaars, I followed you so far, but now I give up. How can integrity be different than my friend not expecting me to lie and me not lie? There was a Korean in the room, South Korean, who said, John, I disagree. How can you have integrity if you don't help your friend? And the fun was that everybody in the room understood both. They introduced in that company a second value: we respect the culture of others. Now, that is fun. So what would a servant leader do? You are a leader of a multicultural group where you know that some people would help their friends by lying, and other would say, no, you have to tell the truth. So let's not get into the discussion in view of time, but it's not an easy one. In America, you don't lie, and in Korea, you don't. You go for the friend. But if you are a multicultural group, if you are a good leader, what will you teach them? Now, in the old paradigm, is that the American leader says, I will tell you that the great thing, and that's called transparency, you never lie, and you always tell the truth. No. Are you always helping friends? No, it's a dilemma, so you need both. And that's what I learned in Japan. In Japan, they said, what we need to do is we should use our friendship to convince our friend he should tell the truth in court himself. So we can talk to the judge to lower the sentence for his courage. Now that is a dilemma reconciled. Because if you look at what is universalism versus particularism, universalism is you need to go for consistency, demand clarity, letter of the law. And the Korean particularist would say, no, be flexible. It depends how good a friend it is, what happened to the pedestrian, and it's more the spirit of the law. And if you look at the scores, you see quite a diversity. From Switzerland, 97% would say, my friend has no right or some right and I will not help. But you're in Venezuela and it's 32%. So you see there are big differences. But reconciliation is you use your friend to get the truth. Now, what do you do as a servant leader when you apply this to business? Global versus local. Global is the universal truth of headquarters, and local is your particular case in Korea. So you take that as a dilemma, and a good servant leader would crack the line and say, if you only go for global, you get the global corporation, and you see the cynicism. The rest of the world is called ROW. If you go local, you are multi-local, and the only thing that connects you is the logo, and like KPMG, while in the global corporation, it's perhaps, let's say, a company that does the same everywhere. And then you have the international corporation, and that is the Statue of Liberty with the local flag, slight adaptation. The servant leader would strive for the transcultural corporation, where you learn locally, take the best practices, which you globalize. Let me give you two more examples. Now, first of all, and you might get a copy later, but you can also make a picture of this QR. We have developed a questionnaire on our app and it's available for free because I do this for Kim. And it's a questionnaire that measures how good you are as a servant leader. And it's difficult to see what we measure. So ask your colleagues to fill it in since it's for free. And then you get a profile and some tips. Now, let me skip this one for the sake of diversity management. I want to give two short examples of what servant leaders do in terms of dealing with opposites. First of all, my favorite dimension of culture is specific versus diffuse. It was based on the work of Kurt Lewin, who as a German went to America and he said, Americans are amazing. You hardly know them and they open up to you. They are like a peach. And the peach has a lot of accessible flesh, but a tough nut in the center. We Germans are like a coconut, a bit difficult to enter, but once you're in, it's soft. The American model, to exaggerate its model, what is public, perhaps by other cultures, is seen as private, like the refrigerator. Before you know they're in there. The car. In America, you need my car, take my car. Don't try that in Germany. They rather offer their wife or husband, but my car is mine. And then we have furniture. In America, they tend to leave their furniture, while in France, they keep the furniture because it's very private. Now, according to Lewin, this leads to a specific relationship. If I relate to you and you relate to me, cut the crap, what is this about? Even titles. When I got my PhD, I was doctor in the university in Philadelphia, but I was Fons at the barbecue. In Germany, the coconut, you're hair doctor everywhere. You're hair doctor at the butcher, guten Abend, Herr Doctor. You come home, guten Abend, Frau Doctor, everything is doctor. Now, that is what he calls the G type. Initially, no relationship, but around October Munich, you share everything. The big problem in international business is when the peach meets the coconut. What is private and what is public? Most famous example, obviously, is loss of face. Loss of face is making public what is perceived as something that is private. Now, what does that mean for leadership? If we look at how we measure this one, we ask people, would you paint the house of the boss? Obviously, answer A is specific. You don't have to paint because he's the boss in the company, not outside. Specific relationship. In a diffuse culture, the answer would be, despite the fact that I don't feel like doing it, I will paint the house anyway. It's my boss in the company, but also outside. That's diffuse. Look at how people scored. So you see in the Netherlands and Sweden, 91% would say, dear boss, go to hell, because 9% are foreigners. In China, it's 32%, much more diffuse. I was surprised by Japan. It shows also the difficulty of research. In Japan, 71% said, no, we will not paint the house of our boss, while I know they're very diffuse. So we interviewed the Japanese who said, in Japan, we would never wait till the boss asks. Now, what does this mean in business? One of the dilemmas that are covered by the balance scorecard, I don't like balance because balance is bipolar. Integration is both sides need to go up. One is you go for financial performance, or do you want to diffusely develop your people? I had that with a big insurance company in France, AXA, and the CEO was worried that the best people were leaving because they didn't invest enough in people. They had a lot of cost reduction programs. So the dilemma was, we are cost cutting ourselves, but we don't want to go the other side because that's called the subsidized seminar. The way they solved it, and the CEO was very smart, he was a servant leader. He said, you know what we'll do? We train people for cost cutting. So all the training suppliers were asked, how can you show that your interventions help us to reduce even more cost? Get the point? So you still develop people, but part of the development is how to reduce cost. That's called reconciliation. That's what servant leaders do. My final example is an example about servant leadership itself. And that is really about how do we get the integration of a wonderful world of, do we believe in the relationship between the specific, what we call electronic hook, we call that high touch, or do we go for high tech? And the reconciliation is what we did at Merrill Lynch. How can you use internet to deepen your relationships? And how can you use deep relationships to have people work on the internet more effectively? When we come to the definition of servant leadership, it is the propensity of people to help reconcile dilemmas, opposites, for better sustainable business. And if you want to see the Lord versus the servant, is status based on what you do, or is status based on who you are? And the reconciliation is when you only go for performance and you judge people on what they do, the output. The risk is what they call lost democratic leadership. That's too much democracy, like sometimes I feel we have in Nordic Europe. If you go for top down, follow the leader, you run the risk like in the Middle East, where you don't get enough feedback and revolutions are there. The servant leader is holding the others, the ladder for others to climb. And that's a leadership model that works everywhere. So, the leadership for the future is, if there is a challenge, rephrase it as a dilemma and try to get opposites together on a higher level. That would be my introduction, and I hope I haven't taken too much of your time.
Never.
Good.
So who is next? Roland?
Yes.
Good luck, Roland.
I am, and that means that I have to put up my slides, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, well, here we go. Let's see if I can get them up.
Mhm.
Where am I going? Desktop, right there.
Share screen. There you go.
So everyone will have questions at the end. So if you have questions, hang on to them, and then we'll have a time
We have
that you
15
can ask
minutes
them.
devoted to that. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Here we go. Let's see if I can get them up. Ah, there we are. But I want to see my slides. I don't want to see all this other stuff up there.
Yep. Click on slideshow at the top, Roland. No, on your bar above PowerPoint.
Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to get rid of this other thing here.
Oh, okay.
Slideshow from the start.
Good. Yep.
Let's go. And while it's spinning, there we are. So I want to talk about and follow up on what Fons was talking about, the importance of having a global leadership mindset. So here are a few questions for you. True or false? Effective global leadership requires having lived in more than one country, requires having traveled to other countries, requires speaking more than one language fluently, or managing a globally diverse team, having done that, or having experienced an international assignment, having been schooled abroad. All of these questions are questions that many people would say would answer is true, that would be helpful or important in having an effective global leadership. Because after all, how does one become globally effective without having these types of global experience?
Het hoeft niet.
I need to go back one slide. There we are. Okay. So I want to talk about the effectiveness of global leadership and why it's important to recognize that global leadership competencies are often not the same as the competencies that are needed in other leadership roles. You ask a number of researchers, excuse me, and you get a list of global competencies, excuse me, of leadership competencies that's quite varied. But global leadership is different. And the important thing to keep in mind is that good leaders in one context don't necessarily make good leaders in another. These three dynamic cross-cultural competencies should collectively produce a repertoire of behaviors in leaders that are related to their success in global leadership activities. Let me just talk about each of them. The first is reduce ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is an individual's nationalistic self-centeredness, the belief that people from other cultures are inferior. Ethnocentric tendencies inhibit the individual leader in coping effectively with new social norms, the values of other countries. And a global leader's ethnocentrism can have a very negative effect on intergroup relations with coworkers, with clients, with subordinates, and it can reduce the success of tasks where a locally responsive approach would be more appropriate. So it's important to reduce ethnocentrism.
En hij gaat ook over dienend leiderschap is nodig in de culturele.
Someone turn their mic off. Their
maar om in de verandering wel gewoon.
Okay. The second cultural competency is cultural flexibility. Global leaders will often need to substitute their preferred way of doing things with a culturally different way of doing that same thing. So increasing cultural flexibility is an important developmental goal.
Ik zat te denken, dat past helemaal bij mij, dat dienend leiderschap.
I'm sorry, someone is talking and it's coming through. You need to mute your microphone, please.
Nou, zet er even op. Hangmat ligt gewoon even helemaal niks, want ik ben moe. Ik merk dat weinig productief ben.
I think it's Marjolein.
Yes.
Maar
Marjolein, please mute your mic. Thank you.
Ja, hoe heet het?
weet ik niet.
So cultural flexibility, or the ability to adapt culturally, is important, especially among global leaders who take frequent business trips in different countries, like Fons does, or those who may accept an expatriate assignment sometime in the future. And the third cultural competency is one of a tolerance of ambiguity. We live in a world that is uncertain, it's changing rapidly, and so tolerance for ambiguity is the ability to manage that ambiguous, new, different, and unpredictable situation that we might be faced with at some point in time. So to effectively conduct business in this new flat world that Thomas Friedman wrote about in 2005 requires a different kind of leader, than we've ever had before. I think to say that the world is becoming flatter is true. We are now living in 2018, and the world is even more flat than it was when Friedman wrote about that in 2005. You only have to travel abroad or pay attention to the expansion of corporations around the world to validate the notion of the world being flatter. And it's this increasing flattening that's the fact that leaders have to contend with to effectively conduct business in this new world. It requires a leader who will not only have to be generally effective in the traditional skills of leadership that are expected, but also a leader who has additional knowledge, skills, and above all, a mindset to navigate through the complexities that are brought on by moving beyond one's traditional borders. That is the challenge of living in this flat world that Friedman talked about. So what is this global mindset? It starts with the ability to recognize three global workforce trends. macroeconomic trends, environmental and social trends, business and industry trends. From the macroeconomic standpoint, and I'm going to speed through some comments that I had prepared to talk about that. The fact of the matter is, economic centers of activity are shifting, and not just globally, but also regionally. Public sector activities are ballooning, making productivity gains very much essential and important. As a consequence of the economic liberalization, what we're seeing is that while 15% of the world's GDP is accounted for in Asia, exclusive of Japan, Western Europe accounts for about 30%, but within the next 20 years, those two will nearly converge. And without clear productivity gains, the pension and healthcare burdens that are required to sustain an aging population will drive taxes to a very high proportion. The environmental and social trend is one that has already, we see already. Technological connectivity is already transformed. It's going to continue to transform. It's going to transform the way people live and interact. I find myself now interacting across the globe as we are right now in this very setting using Zoom. When I was in China last month or 2 months ago now, it feels like it was yesterday, I was introduced to something called WeChat. I had no idea that was a way of living that people have become adapted to. So the technology revolution is just that. It is indeed a revolution, and it's more transformational than we might even imagine. Business and industry is changing in response to the changing market regulations and the advent of new technologies. Non-traditional business models are flourishing. Corporate borders are becoming more blurred. Bigger, more complex companies demand new tools to run and manage them. So those of us who grew up learning and understanding scientific management, what we now know is that scientific management is moving from a skill that creates competitive advantage to, if you're playing poker, it's an ante that you have to have in order to get the right to play the game. So as we look at a global mindset and we consider what it is, it's simultaneously recognizing all of the situations that I just described. It means combining an openness to and an awareness of diversity across cultures and markets, and a willingness to willingness and ability to synthesize across that diversity. Global leadership mindset involves carefully balancing these three overall dichotomies: global formalization versus local flexibility, global standardization versus local customization, global dictates versus local delegation. And in the interest of time, a simple way of describing what I just said there is that an example of a company that has done all of these things would be McDonald's. Which allows countries to invent their own buns, their own bags, their own business practices, all of that while catering to local tastes. In short, a global leadership mindset is the ability to take a global rather than a country-specific view of business, people, and the ability to apply that perspective to a country, taking into account that country's culture. Three important skills are necessary in order to be an effective global leader. The first is an effective and strong thinking and reasoning skill in order to be a successful global leader. The complexity, the uncertainty, the ambiguity that we are dealing with requires that global leaders operate with a knowledge and understanding of a global or international business world that is not parochial, but one that includes knowledge and understanding of the specific and different contexts and situations that they may find themselves in. It requires interpersonal skills, relationship and interpersonal skills, effective to have these. Empathy is one of the hallmarks of high emotional intelligence and is a critical skill to interact effectively across cultures and countries. Fons talked about servant leadership. Servant leaders are very much highly emotionally intelligent and generally display a quality of empathy that is not seen in other in leaders who don't practice servant leadership. Finally, use of self. Knowledge of oneself and the ability to manage oneself well, which again is a high emotionally intelligent competency, is important because things sometimes are very different than they are. Get that out of there, Roland. Things sometimes are very different or unfamiliar, often unpredictable. And because of that, a global leader has to be able to demonstrate openness and curiosity, a sense of adventure, all of which underlies the ability to learn. They need to be able to demonstrate the highest levels of integrity, honesty, fairness. They need to possess the emotional stability and energy that allows them to flourish in different and often stressful circumstances. So it's not just a matter of being, of understanding leadership. It is a matter of understanding both leadership and culture and being able to put them together to integrate them, as Fons talked about in his presentation, in a way that is effective. And that's what I had for you, and I will pass the baton to Jerry.
Okay, Roland, can you get out of your screen share there so I can go in? Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right. For those who are really wanting to ask questions, I don't want to cut that short, so I'm going to go very quickly. And what I'm saying basically is a summary in a lot of ways of what both Fons and Roland have said. Basically, we're at a point, I think, where we need to start considering culture change and leadership as a paradigm. The idea of looking at these three areas together. We're in an era of constant and rapid change. We've got diversity everywhere, and we have many leaders attempting to solve organizational problems with century-old beliefs and practices. Ethnocentrism and bias is frequently the foundation for interactions and social encounters. And many of our contemporary problems are not being resolved. And as I said, in the red below, magic bullets come and go, the problems remain. What's needed? We need to look at a new paradigm. We need to look at a new way of solving human problems with creative solutions. We need to find ways to reconcile cultural differences. And leaders, I'm arguing, are in great need to become more culturally competent, to be able to acquire and effectively use knowledge, to create synergy from diversity, and to think and act holistically. We've been working, Fons, of course, for years, decades now, and myself and others. Roland, we've all been working on the whole idea of looking at the combination of a culture change and leadership, and what are some of the things that are important for culture change and leadership. Well, I summarize it in 4 areas. 1, leaders need to become more culturally competent. We need to learn how to acquire knowledge and to use it more effectively, to create synergy from diversity, and to think more holistically. Think and act. Cultural competence, for example. Fons has a statement in one of his early books, Writing the Ways of Culture. Culture is not a side dish, it's the main course. Many times professionals and leaders are taught culture is something that you deal with. Rarely are people taught to become culturally competent, how to recognize, respect, reconcile, and realize cultural differences. The result, as I've said for many years, having worked in a lot of change projects, is that culture is not managed by leaders. Instead, leaders are managed by the cultures they encounter. And of course, national differences, professional differences, functional differences all lead to diversity. We think that cultural competence is fundamental in all professional leadership and training. Culture needs to be given the relevance and attention commensurate with its importance in our world. And unfortunately, it's often thought of as a side dish or something. Oh, by the way, let's put another chapter in the book on culture, or it's often not seen as the importance that it has in terms of its fundamental relationship to solving human problems. The other thing is, of course, making noise out of the environments, making sense of the noise in the environments we're in. Knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. And knowledge, of course, is subject to the lenses and the filters that we find in our cultural values. Important and related very much to what Fons and Charles Hampton Turner have done, cultural dualities are very much a part of creating synergy from diversity. The dilemmas approach that Fons mentioned, the 4 R's, all those are very important. There's tons of material that Fons and Charles Hampton Turner produced, and I certainly highly recommend a lot of it to you. Finally, thinking and acting holistically. We need to learn to look in terms of both synchronic and diachronic perspectives. We need to see across the board today, comparatively, what things are like. For example, having meetings is something that happens in most every culture, but the actual cultural rules and the cultural expectations and the context for that vary. And of course, when we go from one culture to another, we're often need to understand the context and the relations that are there. Another area that's very interesting to me, and also I know to Fons, is functional differences. There's a lot of functional differences that exist within one corporation or one organization. And we may find that accounting has very different cultural values than marketing or operations when it comes to key dilemmas. In essence, to make my particular presentation summarized, I think that culture change leadership today is absolutely required for training leaders and professionals in all fields. And of course, just to summarize again, all the old paradigms of leadership that Fons mentioned, the culture changing leadership, cultural competence, all those things are important to this new approach that we're continuing. I wanted to not leave my talk without mentioning a program, a Master of Science in Culture Changing Leadership at Cleary University that has just been formulated and will be starting in January. The entire program is going to be dedicated to the approaches that Roland and Fons and I have mentioned to you. If you want more information about it, certainly I highly recommend that you contact them. We can make this information available to you if you should like to find out more. But Cassie is their Director of International and Graduate Admissions, but I certainly highly recommend you contact them about the program, because Kim, Roland, and myself are going to be very much involved with it, and Fons as well in the future.
And Jerry,
yeah,
there are 2 professional certificates as well.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
The details of the program can be found, it can be found on the Cleary website, and as well as information from Cassie and so forth. But if you'll see the content, each semester is pretty much involved with looking at the kinds of things we've been talking about. The one thing I might mention, the residential conference next summer, we're hoping that we can have Fons there, and we're still talking about that with him and with the Cleary administration, but we're hoping that we can have a workshop related to Fons's professional development approach. If you want other things, I might mention there is a Culture Change and Leadership LinkedIn site that Kim maintains. There's Charles Hampton Turner and Fons have a website at THT Consulting. There's a pre-conference workshop that Roland and I and Kim are doing in Dublin at the September ISODC conference. And Fons, of course, does Coach the Coach workshops from THT, and we're hoping, like I said, next June we'll be able to do one in Michigan in conjunction with that new program. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Kim. And these are questions that we had come in. And now if we could come back to Roland and Fons, and if you guys want to offer an answer to any of the questions that have come in advance, and then we'll leave it open to people who might want to ask a question through the chat room.
Thank you, Jerry. I think if we could start with the questions that came in first. We want the early birds to get the worm, right? So which one of our esteemed experts could answer, could you differentiate between anthropological culture and organizational culture? What would you say to that?
If I would ask a counter question, because anthropology is a broad field as well. Mm-hmm. And I think when it's meant that it's the looking at tribes, which very often is equated with an anthropological culture, then I say there are a lot of things that you can borrow from each other. Mm-hmm. And learn from each other. Very often, if we talk about organizational culture, but I don't know if that is really in contrast with the anthropological culture. It's very often an organizational culture that is approached instrumentally. Very often in our consulting practice, we find that managers, for good reason, say, gee, I know organizational culture is fantastically important, but let me tell you why. And then they come with a specific goal. We need to be more client-oriented, or we need to internationalize. And very often, if I understand anthropological culture well, that's not the question asked in that sense. On the other hand, triangulation comes out of an anthropological culture, and it's one of the best ways of approaching an issue in organizational culture. So there are overlaps, if I understand the question well, and there are differences.
Okay.
Awesome.
Kim, can we keep moving through these?
Okay. Thank you, Fons. Can you highlight some of the challenges you faced with cultural integration?
That's a broad question.
Yeah.
As I look at it, I think about the fact that it was more than 50 years ago, and I hesitate to say that, because it wasn't 50 years ago. It was like 40 years ago. I'm 10 years younger than I think I am. But my first experience in dealing with the need to be culturally aware came from a trip I took to Holland, as a matter of fact, Fons, working for a U.S. company that had operations all over the world, but a large operation in Rotterdam. And one of the things that I found in my role was the challenge of helping our American expatriates recognize and understand that they were operating in a country which was not America. And so that was indeed a challenge. But as I look at the question, I'm reminded of the fact that my interest in this topic really began before I knew anything about it. It was sort of intuitive to me that as an American expatriate, that it was important to understand the culture in which we were operating and doing business, and to be inclusive of our hosts in running our business in their country. So that's one of the challenges that I believe natives of any country might have if they are taking their organization into another cultural environment, that they have to recognize that they are making that kind of a move.
Kim, can I answer this next one? What are your methods for resolving cultural and leadership?
Yes. Could I just say one thing first, Roland? I really like that answer, and I think it's so important to give everybody a seat at the table.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And,
sorry, Jerry.
Okay, well, I don't think we can answer that question in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think Fons did pretty good.
Starting to get at it, and I would recommend highly that you read Fons and Charles Hampton Turner's work of a lesser importance. I even put a book out that was on transcultural competence. There are some sources. Be happy to have an individual chat with anyone who wants to know more about that and talk. But I don't think we're going to have the time to get into the various methods and do them justice. So if you can hold that question, if you want to contact us at a later time, happy to try to help you. There's also lots of resources there.
If I could just share one thing that really had a very large impact to me when I went through the Train the Training program is when Fons said, you know, it's not about compromise. It's not about thinking outside the box. It's about creating a new box.
That was me.
Oh, was that you? Oh, okay.
I don't say much, but occasionally I come up with something.
and I just love that, because, you know, so many times we get stuck in this compromise mode that somebody needs to win and somebody needs to lose. And, you know, why can't everyone win as much as possible, right?
Yeah. Okay, the final one there, so we can get to the questions in the chat room. Can you talk a little about instituting change in a high context culture, especially if the change agent comes from a low context culture? Fons, would you want to say something about that?
Yeah, a very good question, by the way. I think, first of all, the awareness that there are different styles of communication. And, you know, for me, a high context culture is that the meaning is dependent on the context in which it is created. While in a low context culture, you don't need to know the context to know what you're saying. And if that awareness is there, that helps. That's one. Second thing, what I found is that if you are a low context person going to a high context culture, what always works is go private. What I found, for example, on a very micro level, if we do workshops in Japan, in a high context culture, you get in the evening, when they go private, a lot of feedback that you otherwise would never get. So my advice is create a lot of private moments where loss of faith is not the case. And then you see that high context cultures, like the wonderful Japanese, can become very low context. They're very straight to the point if it's one-to-one with a bit of sake. So bottom line advice, awareness, and secondly, go private. Then you get to know a lot more, which is so important if you are a change manager.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Fons.
So we just have a couple more questions. Serge had a question. He says, in software development, leaders have been attempting to embody servant leadership for over a decade. Some say 2 decades. Yet these leaders have been failing. Just look around. So what's missing? If the fundamental competence of leadership are not being achieved, both in engineering and in other industries, not to mention government.
Fons, that's...
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly the reasons for failure, because there is also empirical evidence that successful leaders very often, even if they don't know it, are servant leaders. Now, first of all, the metaphor helps. The metaphor in these complex type of things, everybody here is either a child from a parent or is parent him or herself. And I think the best metaphor to understand servant leadership is being a good father or a good mother. Namely, you sometimes are tremendously tough on your kids, severe, and at other times you play the horse. And it can turn over in 3 seconds. Like you play the horse because you're serving your child to have fun on your back, And then you hear that dinner is ready and you say, no, now we stop, we go and eat. So from the serving role you go, and very often servant leadership is mistaken with being a servant. It's not being a servant, it's a servant leader. And that's one point I wanted to raise. Secondly, servant leaders do fire people. Servant leaders can be tough like hell. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Mandela as one of our heroes, you know, he had very tough moments, but the toughness is never done for being painful for the other. It's always trying to help them. And even if you fire people, you are trying perhaps to help them, but they fire people out of love, like here nothing will be happening that will be of any value for you, or thank you for going to another job, you saved the company, whatever. But let's be very clear that servant leadership is not about being a servant only.
And Fons has an amazing book on servant leadership. I highly recommend it.
Anyone else have a question? Because we're at 1 o'clock.
There is a question here. It says, business is driven by quarterly results. So how do you convince leaders to invest in a long-term practice to shift towards what we speak of? How are you able to scale your impact?
Well, I mean, if you're managing culture change and leadership in the correct way, you're actually creating a productive, effective, and adaptive organization. So I would think that based on my decades of experience in working with organizational leaders who are trying to create better organizations, culture change and leadership, as we've described it, is all about creating a more effective organization, and that it would include profitability.
Long-term profitability. And I don't know, I'm looking at the names of folks who are here on the call. I don't know what any of you do, except for what the folks I know do. But if any of you are operating as consultants in the field of culture and change and leadership, I think it's important to have the courage to say to your client that it's important to focus beyond the short term. And if we don't use ourselves to help a mindset shift in the folks who are paying us to come in and consult with them, then we're not doing them a good turn. I would say we're not being good servant consultants in that regard. So I think it's a matter of stepping out of our own way, if you will, and being willing to say to the person who has brought you in to help them that here's something that you need to pay attention to. Competitive advantage and long-term sustainability is what you want, and is equally as important as the short-term results that are going to get you there.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Jerry.
It's 1 o'clock, and I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
I see a lot of familiar names here, and I'm really happy.
Does anybody want to ask one last question? Could we do that?
You're not very sequential, are you?
No, I'm not.
Keep on going, Kim.
Go ahead.
We have one last question. Mike says, how do you explain the trends towards isolation currently powering political movements in the States and the UK? Ooh, that's a good one, Mike.
Well, let Fons answer that one.
Yeah,
no, I'm very worried about it because you know, these trade wars have never led to anything, and Brexit is a stupid idea. That's the summary of my interpretation. But I think the main reasons are that people again go for bipolarity. I have as much criticism about Europe that I do understand that the UK is threatening with Brexit and then even executing it. But that's not the way you solve the problem. Because bipolarity means you're either part of Europe or you are out of Europe. And now the funny thing is they decided to go out of Europe and now negotiate the way back in. Right. And that's stupid. That's bipolar thinking.
Yeah.
We need the UK to make Europe better, and that is not by leaving them. We need the US. Let me think about for what, but we need the US for the betterment of the world. The creativity you are bringing is tremendous. Look at all the industries you have created. And there are so many other good aspects of the US, and that is not solved by building bridges and walls. What we need is a US that, and then we understand some of the things that Trump said, not too many, that perhaps a lot of people are taking advantage of the richness of America. You have been the policeman causing a lot of death of your own people for the betterment of the world. Mm-hmm. Now, some would argue, no, that's for protecting oil. No, the US has done a lot of good to the world. And what we need is to integrate them on a higher level, like the UK, because I'm already missing them in their humor. And it's not by separating it. And so the answer is, I think it's the result of bipolar thinking, that if it's not going this way, we go the other way.
Yeah.
And that's a pity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, when we do send out the link for this presentation, I will also include some books, okay, some links to books, because I think, you know, Fons has several wonderful books, Jerry has a book, and, you know, I want you to be able to order those books and do some further reading. Also, I'd like to put a plug in. Next month, Ed and Peter Shine are going to be, we'll be doing a webinar with them. And if you go to isodc.org, you can sign up for that webinar. I just finished reading the book, Humble Leadership, and it is amazing. So I want to put that plug in. And I just want to thank you all for your time today.
Yeah. And thank you, Fons. Thank you, Roland. And
yes.
everyone else.
Thank you, Dan.
And we're getting lots of thank yous in the chat room. And again, we will get this out to you for listening, for further listening.
And Tracy, it's good to see you from Australia. And Beth, all the people there on Rochelle, Lance. And so we appreciate it. And hopefully you'll be in touch.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Fons. Thanks, Roland.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Roland, Jerry, and Kip.
Okay.